Are you the parent or caregiver of a child who's around 5 years old? Maybe they've just turned five, or they're between the age of 5 and 5.5, or maybe they're getting ready for the exciting milestone of going to kindergarten next. And you might be wondering, how can you boost their language skills to make sure that they can do well in kindergarten? Well, there is one very important milestone that will help a child tremendously as they make this jump, and that is being able to retell a simple story. When a child is retelling a story, they are using past tense verbs, they're using complete sentences, and they're structuring their narrative based on things that they remembered. This small task of retelling a small tale is actually working on so many things at once and also shows where your child is on so many factors at once. So, how can you help your child in this skill? Well, you've come to the right place. Hi, my name is Amini. I'm a speech and language pathologist with several years of experience working with children and their parents to maximize speech and language development. I also have my own private practice for speech therapy, Smarter Speech, where I do the same. And my mission with this channel is to empower parents and caregivers, especially those with children under the age of 5, because this is when a child's language is developing so rapidly. And just little changes that you make in your daily routines can have huge implications for the way speech and language develop down the line, and also for how learning develops down the line. So if you can make small changes in the way you talk and the way that you teach your child, why not? So without further ado, how to help your almost kindergartner or kindergartner retell small stories. Let's get started. So I already touched upon the fact that when we talk about retell, ideally for a simple, repetitive story, a child should be able to tell it from the beginning to the end with some prompting. And obviously, it doesn't have to be just automatically and all at once. You can tell the story a few times to your child first, and then they can attempt their own retell. With time, you don't have to do as many repetitions before your child starts their repetition. But in the beginning, you do want to model that retell at least a few times, and then your child should be trying that retell. So there are 3 ways that I would suggest retelling stories. The first one is just finding videos on YouTube. So screen time is not ideal a lot of times, but screen time done with someone else and with a purpose can be a really good thing. So if you go on YouTube, for example, and you look up any common fairy tales, there's a bunch of videos on there that are really fun to watch with your child. They're animated, they've got great sound, and they're just fun to watch. And then what you can practice doing is at the end, you can pause the video and you could start retelling the story. Some stories that I suggest that you can get started with are stories like Little Red Riding Hood, Three Little Pigs, Goldilocks and the Three Bears, Jack and the Beanstalk. Any of those or any other ones that you find are definitely game. So what you want to do is you want to play this video and then retell what happened in this story. Well, let's see. Let's remember. First, what did she do? She went to the cottage. Then she tried the first bowl of porridge and he said, so in the beginning, you're going to do all the modeling. You play the video and then you model it back. When you've done that at least 2 or 3 times, then what you can do is you can start pausing the video every minute or so and ask your child what happened there. Because what you're doing is you're breaking this very big project into smaller projects. And then what you're doing is you're helping your child retell a minute at a time. And after your child has done this a few times, then you can ask your child, can you tell me what happens in Goldilocks? You're more likely to get a little more follow through that way. So there's a lot of getting ready that happens. First, watching the video quite a few times. Second, listening to you retell. Third, breaking the story up into chunks and then saying each part in chunks. And then finally, the child can retell the story. So without all of that preparation, for some kids, it can be very difficult to retell such a big story. So that's why you want to do this with fun things like fairy tales. And of course, the use of YouTube videos helps. So you can just spend 10 or 15 minutes a day on retelling fairy tales on YouTube. So that's my first and probably easiest suggestion. What I really like about fairy tales is the same story kind of repeats in different ways. So, for example, the same story repeats in the straw house, in the Three Little Pigs, repeats in the stick house, repeats in the brick house. So you're practicing the retell quite a few times. And it's also easier for a child who's just starting to retell stories. Anyhow, moving on, our next way that you can help your child with retell is to pick books that are very repetitive for this task. So, for example, say you're reading The Napping House with your child. Very repetitive, right? So, somebody's sleeping, somebody else is sleeping, somebody wakes up, somebody else wakes up. So what happens here, again, same criteria. You can first start by introducing the book, reading it a few times, and you can then model your retell. So what happened again? First the granny, then the child, et cetera, et cetera. And then the next few retells, you can start asking your child to recap what happened on each couple of pages. So what happened in these last pages? So who was sleeping first? Granny slept. Then the boy slept. Then the dog slept. Then the cat slept, right? Okay, let's keep going. So you want to break this book apart into at least 3 or 4 parts and see if your child can retell when it's broken apart into pieces. After you've done that a few times, then towards the end of the week, normally when I'm working on retell, I work on one book for at least a week. Then towards the end of the week, you can ask your child, what happens in the napping house again, and see what it is that they can come up with in terms of retell. Another book that I would suggest is anything in the Pete the Cat series. These are such fun books because, again, it's the same thing that happens over and over again, making it easy to retell. And there's plenty of stories, but again, with those repetitive elements. So some things that I do want to emphasize here when you're retelling children's books is don't expect perfection. If your child seems to be getting frustrated or they're put on the spot or they don't feel very confident, just ask them to try a few times. And then if they can't do it, you can jump in and model yourself. You don't need to make this a pressure kind of environment because that tends to get negative results than positive results. Easy, slow, and steady is the best way to help your child with retell. And the other thing to keep in mind is if you hear any errors in past tense, so for example, Pete stepped on blueberries, all you have to do is repeat it back correctly. So you can say something like, oh yeah, you're right, Pete stepped on blueberries. He stepped on blueberries. So that's how I would use repetitive storybooks to also work on retell. Remember, you want to ideally stick with one book for a week before you move to the next. So that way your child is getting the maximum benefit of hearing you retell, retelling little by little, and then finally attempting to retell altogether. My last recommendation is to try to find some materials that make retelling easy. So for example, some time back, I got these at Target. I have this Three Little Pigs felt book. I think it was $3. In the same section, I found this Little Red Riding Hood puppet kit. So you can always look at a place like a dollar store or an educational store for just common fairy tale retell props. Or another option is you can check out resources on Etsy or on Teachers Pay Teachers. There's plenty of story retell cards. That's what they're called. You can just print them out, optional to laminate them, and you can cut those story cards out. Basically, they have pictures of each of the parts of the story. And then your child can practice, like with a puzzle, putting those pieces together and then telling you the story. This is really nice because it gives your child a visual cue. It also works on something called executive functioning. That's your child's ability to plan and to order things, which is actually very, very important for cognition and learning. And finally, it takes a little bit of the stress off the child because they have something to help them. They're looking at the cards and they don't feel as put on the spot when they have to tell you something. So my third recommendation for working on retelling is find materials that work. So think of some common fairy tales, maybe the ones you're watching on YouTube, and try to find some cards. So Little Red Riding Hood story retell cards, for example, or Three Little Pigs retell cards to help your child in their retelling activities. All right. So as always, if you're worried about retell, you feel like you've been working on it for a while and you're not seeing any progress, it's important to mention this to your teacher, who might make a referral to a speech therapist, or you can request an evaluation with either the school speech therapist or with a private speech therapist. Sooner is always better. If your child needs some help, it's better to get it earlier when their brain is still so plastic and they're learning so rapidly than it is to get that help a little bit later. So you want to get some professional support as soon as possible if you are worried. Okay, so if you're looking for some more resources on kindergarten language development, check out the description box below. There's a link to our mailing list where there's a free monthly email on language development and speech development. There's also our ebook for kindergartner language development. There's our parent education course on kindergarten language development, and there's a link to some of the materials that I used in this demo. I hope that this video helped you. Thank you so much for watching, and happy talking.